acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting and paying our respects to elders past, present, and extending that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And also acknowledging with respect and gratitude all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be present with us today and online, and celebrating the expertise and wisdom of First Nations people, their relationship with country and each other, and that's continuous over 65,000 years to this very day. I'm joining from Yanjin, Brisbane, the unceded lands of the Turrbal Yagara people, and please do continue to post in the chat where you might be joining from. So today we have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the ACCU scheme, and just to, briefly by way of introduction, I'm Helen Elliott from the Griffith University's Climate Ready Australia 2030 project. I'm a program manager here. Climate Ready Australia is a flagship project of the university's Climate Ready initiative. We work with an alliance of peak body partners that progressing a shared agenda to advance cross-sectoral national climate action. And CANA is a valued peak body partner. So we thank CANA and the Better Futures program today for co-hosting this session. And Lisa, would you like to say a quick hello online as well?
Yeah, thanks, Helen, and thanks, Megan, for taking the time out to provide this briefing. So we have a couple of sector working groups, one focused on nature-based solutions and land use, and one with the corporate and finance, and those two groups of stakeholders in particular. A lot of the organisations that have introduced themselves in the chat, very interested in working with government, your colleagues, to improve the Australian government's approach to delivering positive solutions for climate. So yeah, very happy that this is happening. And yeah, Megan did share before, and please post any questions in the chat as we go. And if we don't get to them in today's discussion, I'll work with Helen to make sure we can follow up on ongoing discussions. So yeah, thanks all for joining us. Back to you, Helen.
Thank you. And as Lisa said, we're really lucky today to be joined by Megan Surawski. Megan is actually the Secretariat of the Governance and Stakeholder Engagement at the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, and was previously been the Director of the Engagement Team at the Carbon Crediting Branch, and the Implementation Manager of the ACCU scheme at DCCEEW. And Megan has a very long history. I'm sure many of you will know her, a long history as a Senior Policy Advisor, and has worked across climate change policy, adaptation, environmental management policy, environmental planning, biodiversity, built environment, sustainability, you name it, Megan has done it. And we're very lucky to have her here with us today to give us a briefing about the ACCU scheme, what it does, where it fits, where it's going, the opportunities and the limitations around that. Again, please, at any time, if you have a question, you can put your hands up and we can pose that to Megan as she goes through her presentation. But we also do have a question and answer session at the end, the last 30-40 minutes. So we can make use of both times to ask questions. So Megan, now it would be a great time to pass over to you. And I do believe you have some slides that you'd like to share. And welcome and thanks for joining us. And we'll just give a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds for Megan's slides to come up, because I do know there's a slight delay. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Lisa, for your introduction. I will make a joke at this point and say, Helen, I think you forgot the work on crocodile management, which I think is one of the more interesting things I've had the pleasure of working on. No, it's like basically done everything from trucks to crocs. So thank you all for your time today and your interest in the carbon crediting scheme. And I do apologise, I am calling in from the office, which means there may be some background noise. What I'd also like to do before we go any further is that I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the First Nations peoples of the country on which I'm calling from today. They are the people, the Ngunnawal people, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and that their unbroken connection to country over 60,000 years. I'd like to pay my respects to any First Nations, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people on the call with us today. So, We're just going to start with some overall slides of context setting about what we're trying to do, and given, to be blunt, some of the discussions that are taking place at the moment at the federal level and what is being proposed by other parties, I think it's important to understand what the government is doing, what our objectives are, and where we're tracking. So the first thing to say is that Australia is actually reducing its emissions. We have achieved quite a bit over the past years, but that's not to say that we don't need to do more. So we have a legislative commitment to actually reduce our emissions, and that's contained in the Climate Change Act of 2022. What that sets out is a 42% below 2005 levels by 2030, followed by a net zero emissions by 2050 target. Now, this is the net zero target in particular is consistent with many of the Paris Agreement commitments, and certainly that target was a recommendation from the IPCC, from memory, for keeping for all countries for keeping the globe within the 1.5 degree guardrail. So that's sort of a context of, sorry, it's a 43% target. At the moment, we're on 42%. We're tracking to 42%. But so what that means is that there is more work that the government needs to do to get that extra 1%, but that is achievable. And hopefully you heard the Minister on the radio this morning highlighting that. Okay, so we are reducing our emissions. What does that actually look like? Well, at the moment, in the context of Australia, we can see where those emissions are coming from. This is important when we're talking about the ACCU scheme, and I'll get to that in future slides, because the ACCU scheme needs to have to count its the abatement that it achieves needs to ideally be reflected in somewhere in these accounts that we report to the UNFCCC each year. Electricity, we can see that that is the biggest source of emissions, and that is where we need to do a lot of our work. At the same time, we can see that if we're looking at the land sector to offset all of these others, it's got a really big task ahead of it. Sorry, I've just jumped ahead. So we actually need every sector to work towards decarbonising and taking its own and making its own steps in that space. Any questions on what's in those different buckets? Just if people have for interest, I'm happy to just quickly talk to that, because it's sort of it's a bit of an unknown bucket. For example, agriculture, that stack there, that doesn't include electricity emissions that are used in the agriculture sector, nor does it include, say, liquid transport fuels for transport. It only includes things like emissions from ruminant animals. It includes management of urea, so manure management, managing of crop residues. When it comes to things like vegetation clearing for crop or pasture land, that's actually included in the land use change and forestry account. All right.
There is a question.
Yep.
There's some comments and some questions as well. Meg Humphreys is asking, where does the water sector wastewater emissions fit within these buckets?
Excellent question. So wastewater actually comes under waste. So from memory, and don't quote me, actually this is around 1% of Australia's total emissions are related to wastewater. And yeah. Okay. So wastewater includes a range of things, including effluent management by abattoirs, for example, and that's relevant to the ACCU scheme.
That was.
And then another question, do we have time for one more question at this time?
Absolutely. We've got a whole hour, people, so bring on the questions.
There's plenty of questions in there. There's lots, actually, but I'll just choose the next one, which is actually around alignment of these sectors with the net zero plan sectors and how that overlaps and how that might work.
Well, actually, here's something. Oops, hang on. Oh, hang on. I just don't know how to drive my computer. Just bear with me. So something I prepared earlier is actually this next slide in terms of that. So the government is working on 60 sectoral decarbonisation plans. And so they are around electricity and energy, so that big bucket that we saw at the beginning, and then the cross-sectional type of things, industry, resources, built environment, ag and land, as you would have seen from that graph, have their own accounts, as does transport. Now, the reasons why it's been broken up into these groupings is because so that specific actions can be taken by those different sectors, so they can be targeted. So, for example, built environment, what can be done to improve urban planning? What are the levers that can be done there? And they cut across. They cut across that electricity and energy area. They also cut across some of the transport, and they also cut across waste, and they cut across land. So that's why some of these were pulled out and done as sectors that are not aligned with the actual buckets. Hope that helps. That
does help. And on another technical point with what these include, can you give us a little bit of an explanation about stationary energy, excluding electricity, and what are stationary and fugitive emissions, please, if you'll clarify?
Well, I would love to start with fugitive emissions because being formerly from Queensland is an absolute winner in producing those things. So fugitive emissions associated with waste methane emissions that come, and CO2 in some instances from things like gas fields, from coal mines in particular. So it does include some modelling around migratory where possible. So when we talk about where seeps pop up, there is some work on that being undertaken as well. But basically, it's right. This is a mechanism in terms of explaining this. When you pop those underground reservoirs, there's likely to be some CO2 and methane that escapes. So those are the fugitive emissions. In terms of the stationary energy, so that is things like not industrial processes, but stationary energy that are used in things like kilns, so steelworks, big refining type plants.
And Megan, if we can go back to the previous chart that you had, if we can look again at the fugitive emissions. At 10.4%. So there's does this consider that any of these emissions are actually undercounted? So Megan Hill asks, does the fugitive emissions consider the recent work that suggests these are significantly undercounted, and is there any work to improve this?
So to answer the first question, you have to answer the second question in terms of that undercounting. So there is a lot of work being done by the Australian National Greenhouse Accounts area to look at ways to, they have a continuous improvement program. It's updated annually. Yes, they are aware of the work that's been undertaken around use of satellites for methane detection, also the potential for using on-site calculators, detectors, for want of a better term, sniffers, around methane in particular. Now, it is quite a large program of work. There was some money given in last year's budget, I believe, to doing that work. It's not an area that I'm particularly an expert in. However, my understanding is that sometime the NGER determination has quite, it's internationally aligned with its reporting requirements. Having said that, though, there is a program for continuous improvement, and the team are working with stakeholders on looking at how different technologies may be able to be integrated to improve the accounting of those emissions.
That sounds great. I think we should move along.
Essentially, it's a work in progress. All right. So that last dot point before I move on, it says carbon credits are part of the net, and net zero is not the complete net because there are different ways that you'll get the net, but certainly they will. So that net and net zero other parts of that net will be non-additional tree vegetation management, for example, will form part of that. So when we talk about where the ACCU scheme fits, it's a small cog, but an important cog of all of this work. It is a mechanism that's going to be used by safeguard mechanism facilities. It's going to be something that supports achieving our emission reduction targets. It also will support the decarbonisation and net zero sectoral planning work that's underway. Some of the technologies and innovations that hopefully will come through under the ACCU scheme will support the future Made in Australia outcomes as well. It's also an important factor for delivering on industry's own climate ambitions, so things like their own decarbonisation pathways, wanting to have a verifiable, credible source of documenting how it's doing those residual offsets rather than, say, using credits from overseas. So understanding that it's contributing to Australia's domestic targets. So that's some of the different drivers and some of the different initiatives and where the ACCU scheme sits in the scheme of things. Too many schemes in that sentence. Apologies there. I'm going to move on into just some basics around the scheme now about what it is. It is a voluntary scheme. What that means is that people do not have to participate in the scheme in terms of creating those credits. Secondly, an ACCU is assessed as being 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent avoided or sequestered / stored in the natural environment. So ACCU projects they're registered with the Clean Energy Regulator, and a project must follow an approved method. So the scheme is regulated by something called the Carbon Credits Carbon Farming Initiative Act of 2011. And it is one of the most complex pieces of legislation I have ever encountered. So going to that complexity, it is actually a highly regulated scheme with lots of provisions around what is to happen when, how things are to be verified, how things are to be reported against. I might pause there because sometimes around the say questions of stored and versus avoided is often a question. So I'll just address that right now. A carbon capture and storage project is actually an avoided emissions project. And that means that the atmosphere never sees the emissions. So that's what we mean by an avoided project. A sequestration project is where it's stored in a natural environment. So at the moment, the only way that you can do a sequestration project is if it's through vegetation. Okay. Any questions before I move on to the next slide, Helen? Because actually I can't see the chat.
You can't see the chat.
I can't see the chat with the way that my computer keeps setting this up.
That's okay. We've got a question about question here. I'll just read it out. Doesn't it undermine the aim of reducing emissions that we're allowing fossil fuel industries, especially gas, to expand production by buying ACCUs and other offsets? So.
Yep, so that is an incredibly tricky question, and I'll suggest that in some ways it's a political question as opposed to a policy question that a government bureaucrat can necessarily answer. What I would say though is that offset should always be the at the bottom of the mitigation hierarchy. So in any good policy approach, they are not the they're not the avenue of first resort. Now, in the context of, if I could compare, previously the Emissions Reduction Fund was realistically the only mechanism by which emissions reductions were being achieved under the previous government settings. Under the current government settings, there's a whole lot of new policies in place, including the safeguard mechanism, to actually require there to be decarbonisation undertaken by the top emitting facilities in Australia. So that's the answer there. Yeah, it's.
Yeah,
it's really much a policy, a government policy that I, as a public servant, would prefer not to try and get into as to whether it's the correct course of action.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, there's one more question about, and it may require one of the previous charts. Interested to know how much of the net emissions reduction are direct emissions reductions, how much are offsets?
Okay. Yeah, no, so this is a really good question, because it's it gets to the heart of, now let me just scroll through my slides, see if I've got one specifically on this. No, I don't. All right, we'll go back to that chart. And I think this is one of the more fascinating, all right, this is getting my nerd on, people. This is, I think, one of the more interesting things about the difference between what we see in the national inventory versus what the ACCU scheme, does. So you may see that in statements by the minister in speech or media releases where it says the ACCU scheme credited 18 million tonnes of abatement in, say, 2022. What that means is it credited that abatement. That does not necessarily mean that that abatement actually occurred in 2022. The National Inventory Reporting independently reports on the emissions reductions or sources, the sinks and sources that it sees. So that is a combination of things like the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme. So that's where facilities that produce over 25,000 tonnes of emissions per year have to report to the government what their emissions profile is and where they're coming from. It's things like, in terms of the land sector, it's using FullCam and using other satellite verification to determine, where trees are, how much they've grown by. Also, in areas such as fugitive emissions and waste, there is data that's collected from the states that goes towards verifying those figures. So, for example, something that I'm aware of in Queensland is that the Department of Resources reports or provides data to the federal government on where all the wellheads are, how many what those wellheads are doing. Similarly with waste, what the different landfills are doing. So it's not just reliant on single sources of data. There is a multiplicity of inputs that's collected from facilities, that's collected from the states, that's collected from satellites that go into producing these accounts. A good example then is to say that whilst, say, in Australia, we would the 2.9 waste emissions, that's a net emission. Oops, sorry, that's a net emission. So we're not seeing, there is actually data in the Australian National Greenhouse Accounts that you can go to that sees what, based on data that's supplied in terms of activities, of mitigation activities, what would have otherwise been the case if that mitigation hadn't taken place, if that makes sense. So you can get a gross figure under the greenhouse gas accounts. I can't explain off the top of my head how to get that, but that data actually is there. So you can actually see what has been avoided in that year from that sector.
Thanks,
It's
Megan.
a really awesome chart, by the way, for the waste sector. Happy if Helen and Lisa, if people have questions about that, I can look to follow up with the National Inventory to see if we can find some instructions on how to get that, because I think that would be quite useful, and it may even be useful for the fugitive emissions to see what sort of mitigation activities are taking place in that sector as well, if we can get that.
Well, that sounds great. And if people have an interest, please just pop a note in the chat and we will be able to follow up by email after this event today.
Yeah, cool. All right. So I might just move along in terms of more going back to the points about how the scheme operates. So these are the different roles and responsibilities of the different sort of key features of the governance structure for the scheme. So certainly there is a minister. The minister is responsible for approving, making, varying, rejecting methods. So methods are essentially the rules that projects must follow in order to claim abatement. So it's not just we reckon it's this, the tree has grown about this much. No, when you submit an offsets report, you have to submit all the details on, you know, to verify your claim and how the offsets that you're claiming. That that's used by the Clean Energy Regulator to monitor project performance, to issue those credits and ensure that there is a high degree that you're getting what it says. So if it's saying you've done this amount of abatement, that you actually result in this outcome. They are also responsible for scheme information and education. So that means putting up, you know, fact sheets on their website and things like that. The department is responsible for policy development. An important part of that is implementing the outcomes of the ACCU scheme review that was led by Professor Ian Chubb in 2021 and delivered to government in 2022. I've got a slide on that, on what that review actually said and where we're up to on that work. The department's also responsible for, when we say making methods, that means drafting, the legislative drafting of the methods. And under a new process called proponent-led method development, the department will be looking to facilitate that drafting of legislative instruments between proponents and our legal area. Because these are effectively, you know, when we say legislative instruments, that means that they're legislation, that means that there needs to follow a particular process. The Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, which will be re-established as the Carbon Abatement Integrity Committee, is a statutory committee that is formed under the CFI Act, the Carbon Credits Carbon Farming Initiative Act of 2011, and that Act sets out what the role of that committee is, and it also sets out you know, different functions of the regulator as well. We have opened what's called the new interim proponent-led method development process. And so as a result of that new process, the Secretariat under the committee will be responsible for assessing what's called expression of interests of proposals for new methods or variations to methods, and then provide advice to the Minister on which EOIs should be prioritised for development. Another important part of their role is to review methods and to do things like periodic reviews, and those periodic reviews actually can be requested by anyone under the Act, and there's something called crediting period extensions. And so that is a review that says, all right, it's coming up to, the first project's coming up to the end of its life. Is the abatement that is being generated by this particular method likely to continue to be additional, and over what period of time? Now, when they're doing their assessment, what did they assess against? And so that assessing the integrity is just three little words there. That's they hold a lot of meaning, and those are a reference to something called the legislated offsets integrity standards. Now, there's 6 of those, and that the abatement being created must be additional, which means that it must be beyond business as usual. So that is a, and this is, so that is, you know, would this have happened otherwise without the incentive provided by the scheme? Is the abatement measurable and verifiable? Can you, to a particular degree of confidence or certainty, calculate what abatement is being created by the activity that's proposed under the method? Is the abatement eligible? So to be eligible carbon abatement under the scheme, it must be able to contribute towards Australia's obligations. Advice on that particular integrity standard is provided by the department to the committee. Are the activities and the calculations, are they evidence-based? So is there evidence to support the claims that the abatement, that the activity is generating the abatement?
Is that 2 a day?
The
5 to 7 days. I'm guessing if
It's
you're
interesting
up
with
to
the
5 to
evidence-based one, and the Act actually refers to it must be clear and convincing evidence. And there is a note in the Act that says that this evidence can include peer review evidence, which would indicate that it's not limited to peer reviewed. But it is the responsibility of the committee to make a judgment call on that, and that's why it's a very serious role that they're required to undertake. The emissions, any emissions associated with undertaking a project must be deducted. So you can't just claim everything. If you are doing an activity and you actually generate emissions, then you also need to deduct those emissions so you get a net abatement outcome. And abatement must be conservative, and that's really critical. So you don't want to be overestimating or overcrediting. So when the committee comes to assess a method, it will take into account, is this realistic? Is it taking into consideration all these other factors which may impact on the abatement that could be created by the method? And importantly, the minister cannot approve a method if the committee advises that it does not meet the offset's integrity standards. It's
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Around all that, because there's quite a few in the chat that all go to what you're speaking about at the moment. So first, a really easy technical one that we can provide would be a link to where the integrity criteria and factors are listed. So we'll get that out after this event. And then
on that, there is going to be an update by the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee on its interpretation of the offsets integrity standards. And the reason for that update is because we have a new committee, we have a new full-time chair, Professor Karen Hussey, and we also are in what we call a post-Chubb world. So we've had some clear guidance on what integrity looks like from the point of view of that independent review.
Fantastic. All right. Another one then concerns about the methods themselves and what scope is there for parties to raise concerns with the Integrity Committee about proposed proponent-led methods.
Excellent question. So one of the guiding principles that the new proponent-led process will have in it is to have let me start that sentence again. One of the key features of the review was to maximise transparency of the scheme. That also includes under proponent-led processes. So an important piece that proponents, if they're successful through the EOI process, will need to demonstrate are things like collaboration and getting reviewed by others, working with others to ensure that other people's views are brought to the table. Now, that is in addition to the legislative or statutorily required consultation period, public consultation that must be undertaken on methods as part of the process. So before any method gets to the point that it gets sent up the chain potentially to the minister, it must go through a public consultation process. If at any time people have concerns about expressions of interest that are being progressed, now you will be able to see, and I'll provide this link to Lisa and Helen as well, we have a method development tracker. So people will be able to see what expressions of interest are progressing or what methods are under development. So if people are reviewing those documents and they have concerns that they want to raise with the committee, or they can do so via the Secretariat, and we can provide that contact details as well.
Thank you. So there's also concern here expressed around crediting periods. A note here that crediting periods for effluent covers at dairy farms need to be looked at. They are 12 years currently based on landfill model. However, effluent ponds will continue producing as long as there are cows. And there's another one. Yeah,
that's an excellent one. Can I just grab on that one? Sorry. Fantastic, guys, because there's actually about to be a crediting period review of that particular method. So please, we would if you could reach out and get in touch with the Secretariat to provide that input to that process, that would be great. That is the type of information that the committee will need as part of that public consultation process. Sorry, that's slightly exciting to get that feedback through here, but that is the type of engagement that we're wanting to do through the Secretariat to support ERAC's decision making.
Okay, do we have time for a couple more questions on this one? Or we're not going to.
Absolutely,
Yep.
we're not going to run. Look, you know, there's other things that we can come back and do another presentation on.
Yeah.
Where, and I think Helen and Lisa has discussed with you. You know, there's the opportunity once the expression of interest of interests have call for expressions of interest on new method ideas is closed. Potentially, you know, we'll follow up with a potential further presentation if people would like to see how that landed, what came out of it, what feedback, and the feedback that the ERAC has committed to publishing its feedback that it provides to the Minister, and a summary of feedback provided to people that submit expressions of interest as well.
Okay. Before we jump to something around international markets, we'll keep it in here with the integrity of these.
Oh, actually, I can cover off on the international one pretty quick. Australia has no commitment.
Okay. So is there any visibility on a timeline as to when Australia will open up to international carbon credits and how these will be regulated? Oh, I think we've lost you, Megan. Megan, if you can hear me, we have lost you.
You have. Am I back?
You're back.
Excellent. All right.
You're back.
Can I just say our technology? Oh,
we've got you.
All right. Look, I've got every screen possible open at the moment. So in terms of,
this is hilarious. All right, apologies for that. I don't know what screen is being shared at this point. So
we've got your slide deck with governance and transparency, and I can see a little blue circle thinking.
Right. All right.
At the bottom.
We'll just maybe, yeah, just let me know if it goes to showing back to people. And I won't play with any of the slides anymore. We just might pause there. So on international credits, there's no, at this point in time, that the government hasn't signed up to linking with international carbon markets. We're going to, the policy rationale behind that is that we're going to need all the abatement that we can to stay on shore and to reach so that we can achieve our 43% target. To introduce, to work, so it's not at this time, but the government may look into it in the future. Okay. All right, so jumping back to those questions, Helen, sorry, I just thought that's an easy one to knock out.
Yes, yeah, it was. Another operational one, can ACCUs be used to offset the operational energy consumption of a business or an organisation, and for how long can we bank the ACCUs?
So the banking of the ACCUs is a vintage question, and at this time there is no vintage on ACCUs. And the ACCU review didn't make a particular recommendation on that. However, the CCA review, I think one of the reviews made some commentary on vintage. But going back to the question on offsetting for businesses, that comes into things like carbon neutral claims, and it depends on the accounting that particular organisation is looking to view. So it's a depends question on the carbon neutral claims there.
Yeah. Okay. Again, about the effectiveness of ACCUs. So what happens if the abatements turn out not to be as effective as claimed? Are there penalties for claiming abatement that isn't actually delivered, both at the point of applying for an ACCU and after an ACCU has been issued?
So we'll start with the I was about to use the term nuclear option, which is not necessarily the most appropriate phrase given the current debate, but there is something called a fit and proper purpose test, not fit and proper purpose test, false and misleading information. So there are serious penalties for if found, if people are making false and misleading claims about the abatement that they're being achieved, and that's under the that is under the Act. Now, there are other options that are available to the Clean Energy Regulator if this is found. This includes this is not. There's, you can do crediting pauses. So if it's found that, there's been over-crediting, and then people need to, say, allow the trees to grow a bit more. That's about it. That's a very basic example. Then they will have to, they will not be issued credit until such time as that gap has been made up. There are other mechanisms under the Act, including enforceable undertakings. So we can actually, what I can do is provide some further information as well on the type of enforceable undertakings and what the Clean Energy Regulator does in terms of working with project proponents in the event that they find or suspect that there something coming through that isn't quite accurate. Now, this will sound a little defensive, but the Clean Energy Regulator does take its role very seriously. It is very committed to working with to getting it right. What I also would say is that the ability to detect, particularly in the land sector, carbon abatement is significantly improving over time, and that will allow greater accuracy going forward. And I would say that for the industrial sectors as well. So we do have to look at the scheme as being always a process of continuous improvement. So yes, you can, there are penalties if you lie about your abatement and you're caught doing it, in a basic way of saying it. Was there a question about permanence?
There was actually, which I was just about to pose.
Yep.
So how do you account for the mismatch between limited duration land-based offsets and the long tail of carbon emissions?
Yeah.
Some emissions from burning fossil fuels will be in the atmosphere in thousands of years, while carbon stored in trees and vegetation won't last so long.
Yeah, so this is there's two aspects to this. One is that there's guidance materials around the types of calculations that you use in carbon offsetting schemes, and they're provided by the IPCC and UNFCCC. What I'd also like to remind people on the call is that the concept of what is permanent in a legal sense is limited to 100 years. So we run into a interesting situation of science versus legal principles. And if anyone's got any suggestions on how we work with that, I'm sure the committee would be open all ears, because it's not easy. It's imperfect schemes, I would say, imperfect situations. So to broaden that out, for example, from the ACT, land here is not, so you permanently don't hold land, it's a 99-year lease. And that's to get around that concept of if you tip over into a 100-year period, it's considered permanent for the purpose of legal principles.
I have a question, or just a slight clarification about that. So legal principles permanence is 100 years, and that's across all aspects of law.
Yeah.
Right.
Once you set something, okay. It's but having said that, though, there are other mechanisms, those offsets integrity standards, that people may wish to interrogate or propose new approaches to under the proponent-led method development process for accounting for that long tail, or provide feedback on for methods that come through. So these are like discounts for risk or conservativeness, etc.
I'm just scrolling back through the questions here, and I really do hope that we've picked up on all the questions that have come in so far, and I do apologise if I haven't picked up on a question just yet. I think we've actually got them all. We do need to follow up with some information after this session. The Secretariat details for the crediting period review, and also the integrity criteria and factored.
Yep.
Oh, Brendan tells me he posted that earlier.
Yeah.
Yes. We'll follow up after.
Yeah.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. Megan, how would you like to make use of that time? Did you want to go back through more of your presentation?
Yes, because I've actually got to go find it again now, because with that little hiccup, I've actually managed to lose it, which is awesome. So just bear with me.
No problem. And just while Megan looks for that, I'll jump ahead slightly and say that we do have an opportunity for another one of these sessions to follow up in about 6 weeks, perhaps with Karen Hussey, who's the chair of the carbon abatement of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, soon to be Carbon Abatement Integrity Committee. So I'll just flag that with you all as another opportunity for us to continue this conversation and to find out a little bit more. So we'll be building on today.
So I have absolutely managed to lose my presentation, and I can't get my mouse to go into the screen that I need it to go into. So apologies for that. Let me see if I can do this. No, all right. So, all right. So what I was going to, in the last couple of slides, what they were going to cover off on, so I'm just going to wing it without slides. Apologies. What I was going to cover there were the recommendations of the CHUP review. So there were 16 recommendations with the government accepted in principle, and they included things like re-establishing the ERAC as the Carbon Abatement Integrity Committee. They recommended things like maximising transparency. They also included recommendations on removing conditional registration of projects without eligible interest holder consent on native title lands. Sorry, I got that sentence around the wrong way. Let me start again. So they recommended removing the ability to conditionally register projects on native title lands without eligible interest holder consent. So that is one of the big major reforms that we will be seeing come through in the future. When it comes to maximising transparency, we've already seen some of that work being delivered. Things like the publishing of carbon abatement areas for HIR projects and other vegetation projects. There's that's a watch this space, so there should be more data flowing out of that. The reason why we have to go through a legislative reform process to enable that is because we need to include what's called a positive or an exclusive list under the Act, because there are very strong and strong secrecy provisions under there. And as David Parker likes to reflect, that if they are breached, actually the penalties are up to 6 months jail for him. So so it's not particularly it's not something to be disregarded, if I could put it like that. Other things that I was going to flag in terms of the proponent-led, there will continue to be work done by both the department on the policy front of that to get the legislative reforms established, legislative reforms done to enable us to move from an interim phase to a fully operational phase. The interim phase means that the minister will prioritise methods based on the advice of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee. The last slide that I had was on the budget outcomes. So we did receive some funding through the budget to continue implementation of the reforms. And so that was 48 million over 4 years. And that includes support to implement particularly the recommendation around supporting First Nations participation and that removal of conditional registration function. So there's a great question. Now I can see the chat, by the way, everyone. So that's awesome. Guarantees of the voluntary cancellation. So it's the same process. That's a really interesting question. So yes, there are some updates to the ANRU Act that are coming forward to reflect for the Paris Agreement. And the Act has already been updated along those lines. Same process be adopted for voluntary actions. That's an excellent question that I cannot answer. So can I take that, being like a bureaucrat, at estimates, I'll say, can I take that on notice? Any other general questions about maybe what's coming up in terms of our method work? What I'd also like to flag with people is that we've just closed consultation on options to reform the landfill gas methods. That was a recommendation of the ACCU review as well. There's also work to remake the environmental plantings method, which is which was due to sunset at the end of September. And sunset, just to flag with people that are unfamiliar with subordinate legislative instruments, all subordinate legislative instruments, so regulations, rules, methods, they sunset after a period of 10 years. And so then the question becomes as to whether you remake them or you sort of do nothing. So that was the situation, for example, for native forest from managed regrowth method, which sunsetted in March earlier this year. And the decision was made that it would not be remade at that time. However, it's still open to people to bring forward a replacement for that method under the current EOI process or future rounds of the EOI process.
Any more questions coming in? I'll make a little comment about the website from a previous conversation that we've had, Megan, that it is a little bit hard to get information from the website.
Yes.
Just some assurance to the people on the call that it's not just you.
Not just you. And so this is where it's going to be quite important, and I actually might, if I can get. Okay, so I actually can't get to the chat. I was going to drop in there the email addresses of who you can reach out to. So there's a series of ones, including the ACCUs, the ERAC Secretariat, the ACCU scheme, and ACCU methods are the three and method proposals. So there's four emails addresses that you can send questions to get clarifications. On the proponent-led method development process, we are holding information sessions over whilst the EOI call is out, and there's also documentation on sort of guidance on what is expected of those proposals under the Have Your Say platform. So happy to share those links as well.
Thank you. And Belinda's just dropped some of those emails into the chat for everyone. ACCU scheme.
Thank you.
ACCU methods and method proposals and ERAC Secretariat. There we go. Any more questions?
Saved by my colleague. I literally can't make anything work on my machine at the moment. I don't know if I'm even going to be able to log out of this.
Yeah, that is okay. I'll pop up my slides. So we might start to wrap it up, and we'll probably have time for one more question if there's something else that
there's a crediting period one. So there is a question that's just come up from Megan Hill. So the crediting period is actually the ERAC Secretariat one. So what we might do is actually provide some guidance on, and I think that's something that we could probably do for the website as well. So it might be good just to provide some guidance on what the purpose of each of those email addresses are for and which one best to go to. Having said that, if all else fails, go to ACCU scheme as the generic one. Yeah, thank you. Belle just jumped in there. Doesn't matter. We're all the one branch. So if you get it to the wrong one, it will eventually get to the person that needs to be. There's not too many of us. So yeah.
Fantastic. Any more questions? Otherwise, we might wrap it up there if nothing else is coming through. And a very big thanks to Megan for an amazing presentation, and thank you for answering so many questions so very well and in great detail. It's been terrific for us to hear directly from policymakers and policy implementers how all of this has come together. It is a very tricky a very tricky scheme for us to navigate, and to understand it's just a small cog in the part of a much bigger system, but it's great to know how that cog actually works and where it's going. So a huge thank you to you, a huge thank you to everybody for joining. So a round of applause there for Megan. Thank you to Better Futures Australia through the Climate Action Network Australia for co-hosting this with us today at the Climate Ready Initiative at Griffith University. We've got a fantastic opportunity for a follow-up briefing with Karen Hussey, who's the chair of ERAC, and that will have to come after the 12th of July sometime. We don't have a date, but just around about in 6 weeks. So we'll be reaching out again. We hope that to be able to build on this. If there's anything you'd particularly like to hear about, you could always email Lisa or myself, and we'll be able to take that to Karen in preparation for the next session. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll leave it there for today. Oh, Lisa, Lisa, do you have any final comments?
All right, just huge thank you, Megan and colleagues, for all you're doing, and taking the time to give us this space for open questions and discussion, and look forward to many more in future. And thanks, Helen and Climate Ready team, for this great collaboration.
Yeah, great to be collaborating together. Thank you all, and we'll be following up with those resources by email.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.